This is the Reaction Podcast. I'm Francesca Peacock, introducing the best of the conversations from the Reaction editors and guests in the last week. Most of our discussions on politics, economics and culture are now also available to watch on our YouTube channel. We're back after a summer break and looking forward to a busy autumn. This week, ahead of the 9/11 anniversary, Adam Wishart's new documentary about that terrible day 20 years ago sparked a discussion between Reaction editor Ian Martin and Maggie Pagano. After the withdrawal from Afghanistan, is Pax Americana dead?
You, like me, were very struck by the documentary by Adam Wishart that aired on BBC One this week on 9/11. It's called Inside the President's War Room, which of course takes you back 20 years to, in a sense, where all this began. Firstly, why did that documentary really grab you so much?
I think it just reminded you of exactly her horror and the tragedy and in fact the magnitude of what happened. You know, we talk about 9/11 almost as an abstract, but just seeing those buildings coming down, seeing Bush on Air Force One flying around the States, not knowing where to land, and him wanting to go back to Washington. I mean, it's just it was like watching a movie, wasn't it? One of those horror movies.
Yeah.
And I think the most striking point, though, was when Bush was explaining why he wanted, I suppose, revenge, why he was at war. And having been through that and seen it so close, you can sort of understand the initial attack, if you like, on Afghanistan. The rest we can talk about, but you know that he wanted to go and get the perpetrators. I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying you could understand the anger that he felt, which he expressed so well.
Yeah, it's a very powerful film that Adams made, and for those who haven't seen it, really recommend it and willing. But there's the way in which the thing was constructed, just the peerless use of archive footage plus the stills taken on the day, you know, inside the war room and with Cheney and with Bush, the team that was traveling with him in Florida. The way that was pieced together was very arresting, beautifully done. I also thought, I mean, it reminded me, and I wrote my column for the Times this week on that question, Pax Americana, and my conclusion is, with regret as an Atlanticist, that actually we can't really rely on America anymore, which provokes all sorts of questions about how we are going to manage our own security. But it struck me, firstly, watching that film, how filial the feeling was on the day, the way in which it felt that because America and Britain and the West and Europe, such close allies, it felt as though we were under attack as well. So it wasn't just common human feeling because of, as you say, the horror. It was that, but it was also this sense that it was an attack on us ourselves. I wonder whether as many people feel that now, partly because of the way that America has changed, but also our assumptions have changed since the Iraq War. Also, I wonder, it's this weird combination with America where it is simultaneously in retreat militarily and diplomatically and retreating into some form of isolationism, but it's also never been more dominant culturally because of the internet.
Yeah.
This is the weird duality. And I wonder if our attitudes to America are partly changed by the fact that we see it all the time now, because we live in its internet bubble, don't we? We live in its social media world that springs out of Silicon Valley. On the Afghan question, I was away for much of it, but glued to the coverage on Reaction and elsewhere. One of the remarkable things about it is, and I wonder if you agree with me, it just happened so quickly. I mean, even 3 weeks ago when we were last talking, Afghanistan didn't seem to be a first order issue and suddenly became the story that dominated and seems to have taken everyone by surprise, journalistic community, diplomats and governments.
Completely by surprise. I mean, it was over really in 3 days, wasn't it? From the Friday by the Sunday night. they had command of Kabul airport. But it's really interesting reading now, for example, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee yesterday, where, actually the British people living in Afghanistan were warned to leave in April. Biden extended the deadline back in April till August. So it's sort of human nature. What it shows is the fallibility of human nature, that we need a deadline. I mean, everybody knew this was happening. We've actually known when Trump did the first deal, but maybe it's just you don't accept it until you see it. But clearly the intelligence on the ground was very, very badly off, because they did think that, the Taliban would take them at least a few weeks to reach the capital, but they were there. And I think it just sort of, in a sense, that shows you the nonsensical view that the Americans could build a nation and support a government. It wasn't like a military force coming in from another country. The Taliban are there. They are the local people. That's the sort of paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, I disagree slightly in that I think the mission was worth it. Those who sacrificed or who lost loved ones may disagree, and I can understand that. But the story of that 20 years is essentially that there were, as Bush said in the documentary, no further attacks on America. There were attacks in the UK, for reasons perhaps not directly related to Afghanistan. But Afghanistan was shut down as a terrorist haven. That's the first victory. Even if that's just a holding pattern, it seems to me worthwhile doing that for 20 years. Also, the fact that it's imperfect and not every Afghan woman got opportunity, or not every Afghan girl got an education, but far more, something like 50, 60 in urban areas, maybe 70% of girls did get an education that they wouldn't have done. That a girl born in 2001 had a chance and an opportunity that wouldn't have been there without the intervention. And you've got to hope, I suppose, that if the Taliban can't cope economically, and if the Taliban can't establish a stable government, then out of it something more positive emerges. But I just also think that I think Blair was right in that sense, is that you can't. It's not just a temporary. If you're going to defend your values, it's not just a temporary intervention that you go in, try and sort out the country, and then leave. It's a kind of commitment you have to make, that the Americans made to Japan, or made to South Korea, or made to Germany. That if you are, people say the Americans are hopeless at nation building, and there's no evidence that nation building has ever worked. Well, try telling that to the Japanese, or to people who lived in what was formerly West Germany. So I think it's that the West has lost its confidence and is suffering a crisis of confidence. And I think the implications of the West withdrawing and America withdrawing into itself, I think it's moving back to something closer to the 1920s in terms of spirit. Of course, it's still involved in countries like Japan, but America is now in a similar position to the position it was in after the Versailles Treaty, is that the political consensus at home and the political consensus in Congress is, look, let's try and avoid other people's conflicts and wars. Let's try and just sort of shut out the outside world as much as possible. And I think what happened in the 1920s shows that doesn't work, because it helped create the conditions for the disaster that followed. I'm not predicting a rerun of the 1920s or the 1930s, but if the West doesn't have a leader that's strongly engaged, and if people didn't like the world when America was deemed to be too interventionist, I don't think they're going to like the world where it's not remotely interventionist.
But actually, doesn't that raise a big question? Biden hasn't actually said that they're going to retreat. What he said is, we're not going to militarily go in and try and impose our values and nation build. And we don't really know what the rest might be, but I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that there'll be a full-scale retreat. I just don't think we're going to see troops on the ground in the same way. And I do slightly disagree with you about that you have to occupy. I mean, in Japan and Korea and West Germany, we didn't try and change those people's cultures and traditions, which is
We did. We essentially, well, it wasn't just the US, it was a combination of the US and the Soviet invasion of Eastern Europe. But I mean, essentially, Prussian militarism was destroyed. The Japanese martial culture and warrior culture was destroyed and replaced with a commercial civil culture. So we went in with a mission which was aimed at sort of detuning these places and turning them into different kinds of societies because of what they'd become in the disaster of the early decades of the 20th century. So I think it is. There are examples of how it is possible to do these things positively, but it requires long-term commitment. I suppose I see that I don't necessarily just blame Biden. To me, it's a long-tailed story that begins with Obama for understandable reasons after the Iraq disaster. He begins the process of withdrawal from Europe and essentially trying to say to Europe, you're standing on your own 2 feet. Trump accelerates that, and then Biden is really just is finishing the job. And I suppose what it means in terms of guarantees to allies, that's the thing that really worries me. If you look at how America's just behaved, and if you're the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian president was in the White House this week, or you're in Taiwan and you look at the dispensation, you will now make, I think, a slightly different set of calculations about American guarantees, and authoritarian powers are going to pick up on that.
Now, politics in Northern Ireland looks as though it might be changing. This week, for the Reaction podcast, Ian Martin talked to journalist and author Ruth Dudley Edwards about the new star of unionism, Doug Beattie, leader of the revived UUP.
Ruth, I wanted to talk to you about Northern Ireland. You think there is movement in interesting ways in Northern Irish politics at the moment. What's happening?
I think there's a chance, Ian, but Northern Ireland usually lets one down. I mean, what you have to know is the backdrop of Northern Ireland is that everybody was ecstatic in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, but that was actually predicated on there being people wanting to share power for good reasons. It was intended that the two parties that would dominate would be the STLP, the Nationalist Moderates, and the Ulster Unionist Party, which was, again, middle of the road. And you're talking about two men, David Trimble of the UUP and Seamus Mallon of on the other side, who were decent people. And all sorts of problems in bedding down, but they were getting on okay. But both their parties were supplanted by the extremes. And Tony Blair deserves a lot of credit for that, because he always wanted to bring in the extremes. So you ended up with two parties always in power, sharing power, gradually forcing the populace to vote for extremes to keep the other one out, because they hate each other, right? The DUP and Sinn Féin hate each other. And Sinn Féin wishes to bring down Northern Ireland, wants to destroy it. I mean, that's its stated position. And there is no meeting of minds, and making any progress is terrible. So it's been going on, trundling along like that. And with unionism, people who don't even like the DUP vote for it, because otherwise Sinn Féin will be on top. And what's made a difference has been a profound, in the last few years, distress over the protocol, the Northern Irish Protocol, which is seen to be an attack on the role of Northern Ireland in the Union, and also deep despondency with the leadership of the Unionist Party, and a feeling that Sinn Féin was running rings around Unionists when it came to the justice system, always getting the police to appease. The police leadership has been shocking. So people are angry and rather desperate. And they've had three leaders of the Unionist Party in the last 4 years. The Ulster Unionist Party, DUP, had Arlene Foster, you remember,
Yeah.
now replaced by Jeffrey Donaldson, who is old DUP. Anyway, we're at a stage that a new kid came on the block who has upset all sorts of people, really, because he's so unexpected. And he's strangely wise, Doug Beattie. Shall I talk about him?
Yeah, so Doug Beattie's the leader of the UUP, that party you mentioned at the beginning, Trimble's old party, which was expected to be the sort of dominant unionist force at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, but faded away. And now under Doug Beattie is back. Tell us about him. It sounds like a remarkable life and career that he's had.
Yes, he's only been leader for 4 months. He joined the party in 2014. Well, his background is really very unusual for the provincial Northern Irish politician, because normally they come from the business classes or eternally politicians since almost birth. His mother died when he was 12 after 2 years of suffering from cancer, and very badly, leaving 5 children, and her husband really relying on alcohol to get him through. He had been a member of the Ulster Defence Regiment. The family was really in bits. And Doug, one day, he found his father's personal protection weapon, and he was playing with a friend, and he shot the friend in the head, accidentally, obviously. Now, the friend didn't die, but and they are still friends, but he was very badly injured. And Doug was desperate at this stage, and at 16, he joined the army. He joined the Royal Irish Regiment. No educational qualifications whatsoever. And he worked his way up over 28 years. He ended up getting a commission, captain, but he had worked his way up to sergeant major. He'd been in Kosovo, in Iraq, in Afghanistan a lot, and it meant a lot to him. He had a lot of friends there among Afghans. So by the time he came back to Northern Ireland, I mean, he had a family, but, you know, it's not great being the family of somebody who's away for these long periods. It's held together. But he came back and decided to join the Ulster Unionist Party in 2014. And he became councillor pretty rapidly. He's had two, because when people got to know him, because he wasn't known, he'd been away too much. They liked the straight talking. He's a very straight talker, and he's very sensible. He doesn't get fazed. Other politicians are forever looking over their shoulders to see who is behind them, either on their own side or on the opposition side. And he had 2 chances to run before this year, to run for leader. And he wouldn't, because he thought he was too new, and he would see how things went. And he observed, I think he spent those years observing all the mistakes that people make. He's not slow. He's very fast on his feet, very articulate, but he doesn't rush in. So this year, when yet another leader was biting the dust, he did stand, and he won handsomely. And he's had 4 months to establish himself, and he has established himself. And he really bothers Sinn Féin, really, really bothers, because nobody quite has his measure yet. It's too early. But what is very clear is that a man who's been fighting in the army for 28 years is not really going to be easily worried or distressed. He just stands there, and when he's asked a question, he answers it. And he answers it straight. And this is, could that catch on in politics, I wonder? But well, it's a lot to ask, but I mean, it's just that. I mean, I said there's 2 people recently who are in the throes of negotiations with them about something new that all the political parties are saying is awful. And each person said, and of course they're all lying. And I said, including Doug Beattie, and they said, oh no, of course not Doug Beattie. Now, this is after 4 months. It's the assumption that he doesn't lie. He doesn't dissimulate. He says what he thinks. This is good. This is very exciting. And there was a poll just about a week or so ago, which showed his party had suddenly shot up. Now, it's not huge amounts, but 4 or 5%, quite serious. The DUP were falling back. And the party in the middle, which is called Alliance, that all the nice liberals want to be in charge, is falling back as well, because one of the reasons that the UUP was losing, well, that actually the unionist parties were losing members, was that the young are not interested in parties that are against social progress, that are against single-sex marriage and that sort of thing. And Doug, when he set out his stall, said, quite a lot of you won't like this, but I'm actually in favor of single-sex marriage and abortion. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be imposed anyway. So I suggest we should get on with actually trying to make the health service work and make this a better place for other people and stop arguing about that one. And somehow they've accepted it. So the people who hated the traditional views are going to a smaller party, yet again, the traditional unionist voice, but that's a one-man show. So this is just a protest vote. So, I mean, the question is, can the Ulster Unionist Party displace the DUP? And I think it's possible. I truly think.
What's the time frame for this? I mean, what are the key electoral challenges, or where will this be tested?
May next year for the Assembly. Now, trying to explain Northern Ireland is impossible at the best of times, but briefly as hell. Lots of side deals were done over the Blair years, and very dubious some of them were, and normally with the extremes. So the middle of the road parties, because there's 5 of them in government together, and the ones in the middle are ignored, essentially. One of the deals done behind their backs was with Sinn Féin and DUP, who had decided it would be a good thing if the first minister came from the biggest party, not the biggest community vote, as it were. So there is now an absolute panic among unionists that the biggest party next May will be Sinn Féin.
Yeah.
Doug Beattie, I think, is capable of getting through to people that it doesn't actually matter, because they're actually, the first and deputy first minister are on a par. They're actually joint. Mm-hmm. It's all cosmetics. Now, you need confidence to be able to do that. But if he could convince them of that, so it doesn't matter that you don't have to decide just to vote for one party, the biggest one on your side. That, I think, could have a huge impact. There's also PR, which would help. So there's a real chance that the punters might actually take a risk in their terms, because there was this terrible feeling in both communities. We've got, people who hate Sinn Féin saying we've got to vote for them. People who hate DUP saying we've got to vote for them. We've got no option because the other bastards, otherwise will be in. Yeah. That's got to be broken. And I think that can be broken. Now, I admit, I always will admit, Ian, that I'm prone to optimism. But I haven't felt much optimism in several years in Northern Irish politics.
Yeah. Where does the Northern Ireland Protocol and the row over Brexit fit into all of this, do you think?
Well, nationalists love it because they think it's one of the eye for the prods, really, essentially. All unionists hate it. And where does that fit in? Well, of course, they're not quite sure what to do about it. You've got a position that, and I hope the British government is beginning to take it seriously, where what you might call I don't want to call them the extremes, but the people who are known as loyalists, the tremendously proud people, usually at the bottom of the heap, the guys with the banners, the guys marching in the streets, the people in the Cinque Estates. They're absolutely, they feel ravished by this. They feel that this is a sign that the British government want them out. And they're very angry indeed. And there's a real chance of street violence. There's been an awful lot of protests and the rest of it. Somebody's got to help them out of that, make them realize there is a possibility. And the British government has got to come up with finding some way of getting a deal with Europe that doesn't screw up trade, which is what's happening in Northern Ireland with the protocol. I mean, it's accepting, to send a bunch of flowers to your mother is a complication these days. To send the paperwork, I think, nobody could have expected the EU to be as frightful in terms of being pernickety, just for the hell of it, as they have been. And everybody is angry. And there's a feeling that Boris sold them out, that he doesn't care about them, which is odd in this, I mean, unfortunate, because actually from all one hears from Whitehall, Boris was the most unhappy about having to give way on that border. But he came in on a shambles of a negotiation. The border should have been a land border. That's an argument for another time. So it's either got to be sorted out with the EU, or Boris has just got to declare it done, null and void for us. We've got to renege on it, but he can't leave it as it is at the moment. It's poisoning unionism. And these, after all, you're talking about the community that are the patriots, the ones who want to stay in the union, the ones who love Northern Ireland and want to keep it going, the ones who want to make it work. You don't alienate them. I read with interest, about what the various leaders of the unionist parties are saying. And again, I think BT, he's focusing on what is most important thing at the moment about the protocol. It's what it's doing to our drug imports. We can't get medical supplies. This is the first thing before we do anything else, is to resolve this one. And pragmatism is rampant. We don't like it, we don't want it, but if we can make it work, oh, that's a different matter. So I think he's talking sense. And I think he's talking sense to Dublin. And I hope Westminster are beginning to take notice of him, because hardly anybody had heard of him until now.
This week, in the third episode of our new show Press Review, Ian, Tim Montgomery and Maggie Bogano chose the stories in the media that grabbed them, from Angela Merkel and the likely next German Chancellor to Dominic Cummings' latest long musings, from the refugee crisis to Boris Johnson. Here's the whole show.
Let's kick off Press Review, Maggie. And the first story that you're going to talk about comes from the Daily Telegraph in London.
And it's today's Telegraph. And a great headline: Boris wanted to be the next Churchill, but he looks more like the heir to Merkel, by Alistair Heath. It's a very convincing article once you put all the bits together. First, they share a characteristic that neither of them, they both want to be liked. And this, in a sense, is a flaw, because what they've done is they appeal to every part of the population, if you like. And he used the example of the way that Merkel switched in 2011, if you remember. Once the youngsters went crazy about nuclear stations and so forth, she just, within a couple of days, basically, post-Fukushima, she just, banned all new nuclear. And of course, they, ironically, now use more coal than they ever did before. He also cites a similarity in that, on foreign policy, they haven't been particularly clever. She miscalculated over Brexit hugely. She could easily have helped Cameron to get a deal. And her refugee policy, although it was well-intentioned, I don't think anybody can doubt her sincerity, actually bringing in 1 million people. I don't think he was trying to say, this is what we're doing with Afghanistan, by the way. That wasn't the point. It's just that she was trying to be good in every sense of the word. And as Alistair moves the argument, he says the danger with this and what she has done is pushed. The CDU is now 20% in the polls, and the SDP is, doing very well, and so are the Greens, fantastically well. And so what by trying to please everybody, she hasn't actually got real solidarity with any one group. Thus, you're seeing this fragmentation and a push towards the left. You could have the most left-wing Green government in a few weeks' time in Germany. And the danger is that if Boris keeps on wanting to please everyone, the environmentalists, even without thinking it through, net zero is £1 trillion minimum it's going to cost, that he could fall into the same trap. And it's a good warning. And as Alistair says, he hopes that Boris reads it, and he should.
Just on the Merkel point, Tim Montgomery, what to make of this exceptional political performer who's been German Chancellor for so long? I always struggle, and sometimes German friends criticize me for being too anti-Merkel or not understanding her her appeal as a stabilizing force and someone who is just reassuring. But I often struggle to work out what her achievements other than longevity are. Am I being too harsh?
No, I don't think you're not. I'm a Merkel skeptic as well. She's definitely an extraordinary political phenomenon. You know, when you look at her farewell tour over recent weeks and months, and you see some of the footage of her being there with Clinton or leaders that we've forgotten about. You remember Merkozy, the Merkel-Sarkozy alliance that was supposed to run Europe. So she's definitely been a great marathon runner in politics. She's called Mutti by the German people, mother. She's sort of mother of the nation. She brings people together. But, the last serious economic reforms that took place in Germany were done by Gerhard Schröder, her predecessor, on labour market reforms. There's nothing really happened since. Some of the decisions she's taken, just referred to by Maggie, on nuclear power, have caused massive unexpected effects on the German economy and not actually helped fight climate change. You could say, however well-intentioned her acceptance of Syrian refugees was, it probably caused the populist wave across the Western world that helped Brexit to happen and Trump to be elected. And of course, I think increasingly, under her time as Chancellor, Germany's become dependent upon Russia, particularly for gas imports with this Nord Stream pipeline that is being built. And so fundamentally, at the heart of Europe, it's one of the reasons I supported leaving the EU, the German state is compromised. If Russia is one of our strategic foes, then basically that strategic foe is powering Germany. So I would happily be on your side of the table, Ian, with your pro-Merkel friends.
Do you think, Maggie, that the defense of her, is there something in the defense of the idea that, look, after Germany having had, how can you phrase this, after the 1980s and 1990s, a period of sustained excitement, the difficulties of absorbing the East, the big shift at the end of the Cold War, and then Schröder, who presented himself as a reformer, that what she offered was the appearance of stability. I would argue it was sort of geopolitical stagnation, but that the situation quite suited Germany, didn't it? It became an export power again under Merkel, and she didn't really want too much excitement, and that suited Germany.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And perhaps more critically, joining the euro suited Germany because you had a devaluation of the Deutschmark by about a third. I mean, let's not forget that. So, and that brought enormous wealth, which I think leads back to some of their problems. Tim, you mentioned it too. There's been no economic reforms in Germany for the last sort of 20, 30 years. The Mittelstand is still very strong. They still got their car industry, although that's been hit by scandal after scandal. But in terms of biotech or digital and high-tech industries, there's been no innovation, very little flexibility and innovation in the economy, which I think will come back to haunt them. But your point is that, yes, she's stable. I think Mutti is the key word. She gave them a sense of reassurance, didn't she? She sort of put her arms around them. And yet, if you take the prognosis that Alistair has given, actually what she's done by putting her arms around everybody, she's splitting them in a way that they haven't been split for years. And now you're going to get a sort of real feast of ideas, although her successor, Armin Laschet, is clearly not very exciting and is doing very badly.
Struggling. I mean, I suppose the Germans would say that some signs of digital investment and at the startup level, and some signs that Germany's starting to motor in terms of digital, but nothing yet.
Nothing in comparison to rival America or France.
But Berlin is livelier, but I think the point is generally true. Yeah.
And also something else, I mean, corporate Germany, let's remember Dieselgate, one of the biggest scandals we've had in the last sort of 10 years. It's astonishing what happened. If that had been Britain or America, they'd be lambasted everywhere, and Wirecard too. But they're very good at hiding their scandals.
Yeah.
One good thing I think about there just being a German election on and it being a critical contest with Merkel going is that there is there's a lot of good, interesting stuff around. And Tim, I know I'm going to come to you next with the next piece that you're going to highlight. There's a lot being written about Germany, and we've talked before, haven't we, on these episodes about how Germany's such an interesting country, such a natural ally. Let's put Brexit to one side, but even beyond that, sort of cultural connections. We should hear more about Germany, and we should pay it a lot more attention. Tim, you want to highlight a piece from Jeremy Cliff in the New Statesman, I think, about the man who could be the next German Chancellor.
Well, Maggie and I didn't compare notes, but we always have Germany on our minds in various ways today. But Jeremy Cliff is the international editor of the New Statesman. He actually runs a very good podcast. He used to be at The Economist. Some viewers of this may remember him as a guy who tried to launch an anti-Brexit political party on Twitter and had to be sort of stood down by his bosses at The Economist.
It's one of my favourite 24-hour periods in Twitter. It was very, very amusing, but he's a very smart guy.
He is a really smart guy, and he knows German politics incredibly well. And I think we said on this programme before that we perhaps need to, as people watching and understanding global events, to think a little bit more about the individual European nations, not always be talking about America and European Union level politics. And yes, the chancellor that has been dominating European politics for so long, as we've just been discussing, will definitely be leaving next month in the German elections. And there's been a yo-yoing in German opinion polls. There was a period when the Greens were even ahead. Then the flooding struck, and the CDU candidate Laschet, who was preferred by the establishment over the more sort of conservative right-wing CSU candidate from Bavaria, who was more charismatic. And suddenly the leader of the SPD, the Social Party Demokratik from Germany, which was written off, supposed to be part of the complete decline of social democracy across Europe, is leading the opinion polls. And they're about sort of 25, 27% in opinion polls. Some polls now have the Christian Democrats, Merkel's party, under 20%. So there will definitely have to be a coalition, which will include the Greens, which is something you might want to emphasize, Ian. But the basic sort of point now is seemingly this guy, Olaf Scholz, who started on the left of German politics, but slowly moved to the centre and more reforming character. He's now the preferred chancellor by nearly 50% of the German people, while Laschet is down at just under 20%. You may have seen on social media, he was sniggering in the background when the German president was talking about flooding a few weeks ago. And that is sort of one of the sort of reasons why the electorate, I think, have turned against him. But I think it will be interesting to have a social democratic leader as the chancellor of Europe's most important country, if this does happen. But I think the power that the Greens will have in this alliance will also be incredibly significant, pulling Europe perhaps further towards faster, more comprehensive action on climate change.
I wonder, I mean, it's not on our pick of stories, but we're going to be talking a lot about what's coming with COP26 in the next few months. I mean, which is the great gathering, the environmental jamboree in Glasgow in November, which is supposed to sort all these problems out. I wonder, though, just the Greens are, as you say, in an interesting position in Germany. In Scotland, the very far left Greens have joined the SNP, and not full coalition, but in a governing arrangement. I just wonder, though, whether sort of things have tipped a bit on greenery, a bit too to such an extent that they're losing the battle. Hugo Rifkind wrote about this in the Times the other day, about how the extremism really doesn't work because it looks inherently ridiculous. When you have Extinction Rebellion, taking over the World Wildlife Fund office in protest against their conservation activities, that's not an agenda which is going to convince anything like 51% of the British public that you're sensible and to be trusted. But the interesting thing about the Greens, I suppose, in Germany is that they are a different beast, though, aren't they, Tim? They have been moving towards the centre steadily.
There's sort of the division in the German Green Party between the Fundis and the Rialtos. And the Fundis are the fundamentalists and the Rialtos are the realists. And the Rialtos, in a way, have sort of got control of the German Green Party. And so I think Caroline Lucas would probably be seen as a bit of a nutcase in the German Green Party. So I think it's important not to sort of assume that, what we think of as the Green Party, you're quite right, will get the authority. And, their power in Bavaria as well in Germany is because they emphasize a lot of the sort of basic things that the ordinary Conservative voter emphasizes here. It's about conservation of the local environment. It's planting trees. It's about the number of bins and things you have in Germany for recycling, all the different categories and that. They take all of that sort of micro environmentalism incredibly seriously. And they're not as progressive on some of the other sort of left-wing issues. So they're an interesting casebook. But in a way, for those of us who worry about the economic effects, the impact of taxation of climate change policies, they are more challenging in a way, and perhaps rightly, but they will probably have more impact because they have that sort of reasonableness and credibility on the general direction of climate policy. And if a Caroline Lucas type administration was being elected, because they would easily be dismissed because their policies don't have coherence or would be just too damaging.
It's going to be interesting to see, isn't it, just how that plays out. If the Greens play a big role, then just what does it look like a relatively moderate Green Party actually being in power, and whether that then creates a wave of similar shifts across other countries in Europe.
Worth very briefly stating, it will be what the Germans call a traffic light coalition. Yeah, likely it will be red, green, yellow, and yellow is the FDP. Now they've always traditionally been the partner of the CDU in German politics, and they are more liberal and reformist. So there will be potentially quite a creative tension between the more dirigiste policies of the SPD and having the FDP in there, but keeping up with the various positions of the German political parties is full-time work. Jeremy Cliff does this profile brilliantly, by the way. Really. And
just on Scholz himself, you said, Tim, that he begins on the left or the far left of German politics and then moves towards the centre. What else do we know about him? What should we look out for?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that he basically ran Hamburg for a period, and so unlike a lot of the British politicians who've never really, because of the nature of the very devolved German system, a lot of the people that emerge through the German system, running a state as a governor in the US, they actually have got sort of practical experience, and that's true of him as well. And it wasn't true of Merkel in the same way. And so he's just got that executive experience that quite a lot of people in Germany value greatly. And so there's an ability to sort of just we know before he gets there potentially that there's a basic competence about him. And I think plenty of people frustrated with politics at the moment because they don't think politicians have done anything in real life, inverted commas.
So
do you think they made quickly, Tim, do you think they made a big mistake in not choosing Markus Söder?
I do. Yeah,
that's what I feel.
I think if you're a conservative of my disposition in Germany, I really wouldn't have a candidate in this election. And one of the big consequences of Merkel's extended time is she hasn't, of course, really been in power. She's been in coalition with these other parties at various times. The way Germany has moved on energy policies, minimum wage, general level of taxation, etc. It feels like a left-wing government in many respects, and so and that's carried on. Whereas the CSU from Bavaria, they traditionally are the more right of centre, more conservative party, and I think if they provided the joint CDU-CSU candidate for Chancellor, I think it would have been a more interesting race. And I think there may be turnout issues as a result of the choice by the CDU.
Interesting. Now, speaking of regime change and potential or otherwise for reform in politics, shall I go next with my first choice, which is about regime change in America? And my first pick is Dominic Cummings' latest Substack email, now, which is a subscriber service. Now, I think if we were to talk through the whole thing, this episode would be 5 or 6 hours long. So I don't propose, don't worry.
Please don't.
And Maggie and Tim.
I've been reading a lot of Mr. Cummings's pourings and output. And if I may be cheeky, I might suggest he gets a rather good editor. It's great stuff, lovely style, but everybody needs an editor. And he does have a wife who's an editor. I'm not volunteering.
A distinguished editor.
Yeah, I'm very distinguished.
If that's not a contradiction in terms, yes. So you hear that if you're watching this, Dom, then Maggie is offering to edit your copy.
I didn't quite say that, Ian.
Cut it back to 750, crisp, well delivered.
For a large fee, Maggie. Don't yourself cheaply.
No, we'll do it just for the love and just to improve the copy. But so his latest piece is Regime Change 2, a plea to Silicon Valley. Start a project now to write the plan for the next GOP candidate. But I subscribed a bit like you, Maggie, right at the beginning when he was primarily taking it out on Boris and revealing a lot about what was going on in Downing Street. But this is a different kind of piece, which post-Afghanistan essentially says that the government doesn't run the government, or the politicians don't really run the government. And the big problem in Washington is a kind of permanent bureaucracy, which is, I think, curious considering how, that there's a changeover between administrations and the way that the way in which each new administration brings in its own officials. But it's a really bleak denunciation of the political class, which presents it in very, very dark terms. In Washington, as in London, the golden rule of government is the government does not control the government, and anybody who tries to change this is seen as the enemy by the bureaucracies that actually control 99% of the government.
I wonder who Dominic Cummings is thinking of in that context. I couldn't imagine.
So, I mean, and it also has a good swipe along the way at journalists, presumably knowing that quite a lot of us hacks are subscribers to his email because it is interesting. And as he says here, quite a claim actually. I wonder how many he's met. In the UK, the hacks at the Telegraph or the FT are much more similar to hacks at the Guardian and the NYT than they are to entrepreneurs or people on average incomes. Well, they're journalists. They've got quite a lot in common, even if and sometimes some of the very best journalists on a paper which might be deemed to lean to the center left or lean to the center right, certainly doesn't vote that way, but it is a hack because they're doing it for a living and they also happen to believe in it. So I think it's sort of peculiar misunderstanding that everyone in journalism is there with some sort of automatic, obvious ideological bias. It says en masse
He's right about the lack of entrepreneurial spirit, though. Most journalists on those papers have never had to do their own venture, risk their own capital, have skin in the game. So it's very easy. That makes it much easier for them to fall into these ideological traps. Most journalists would probably go out and work somewhere else for a while.
But they're
not accountable.
But there's a bias in journalism towards an obvious bias towards failure or stories of failure, simply because I think good news is important, and there should be more about innovation.
There's that maxim: if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah, still the human instinct and reader instinct to hear that thing when you walk into a bar and you see your friends and you tell them something really positive that's just happened in the world, they won't find this news very arresting. But if you tell them something shocking or potentially scandalous, you grab them, and a lot of media operates on that principle. I think that I was going to ask you, Tim, about the Cummings shtick, is that this is I think there's a lot in here that is interesting and relevant. Incidentally, I should point out that what he's asking Silicon Valley to do is to fund a sort of vote leave style, but secret, although he's publicizing that it should exist, operation to work out how to stop Trump becoming the candidate, because Trump versus Biden / Harris is just another 4 more years of the same, and American needs and the West needs, he thinks, something completely different, a new project run by tech entrepreneurs, which scares.
Well, they run the world anyway. They run the world anyway.
Yeah.
Facebook, Amazon. I mean, it's very bizarre. They have
it is
power now.
at the something I've noticed reading his Substack and enjoying it and getting a lot out of the references is that once again, Tim, he's an absolutist, isn't he? Everything is there are very few shades of grey. I mean, the idea of complexity is alien, although perversely Dom is always going on about how complex the world is and what a super brain it takes to understand it. His judgments or his conclusions about the motivations of individual politicians or the way that people in bureaucracies work and think, or why they might be conservative, or why they might have genuine concerns about excessive radicalism, is very, very black and white, always, isn't it?
Where I think I'm getting here, I think it's a really interesting question that you've just posed, and your insight. I haven't deliberately subscribed to his Substack, so I haven't been following the references that you have, and this is how he behaved. I remember this, and how he behaved in Tory HQ when Ian Duncan Smith was leader. He's one of these people that when you first meet him, you think, my goodness, he has an amazing mind. And then he partly does have an amazing mind, but he reads very deeply into one sort of narrow area of policy and throws you all of his knowledge on that policy area. But actually, I think what we are missing in government and public life generally at the moment is people who understand enough about how developments in politics, economics, culture, and technology relate to each other, and how the fact that we're seeing a multitude of changes all happening simultaneously, that for me, rather than just technology or the rise of China, it's the way that these ideas are playing together that makes governing our world so difficult. And yes, you do want specialists of the kind that Dom Cummings is becoming, but actually you only want them as part of the team. Yeah. What you really need at the top of governing systems are people who are interested in a broad range of ideas and are knowledgeable to time. Was it Matt Ridley who said it? It's about ideas having sex with each other. That's the phenomenon we're seeing in the world today. And governing successfully is about understanding how the currents that are shifting our world, how they all are meeting and impacting.
Well, Dom, if you're watching, we'd love to talk to you about all of this. And I think that's a very, very good way of putting it, Tim. That idea that he's assuming that his areas of expertise and specialist knowledge trump everything else, whereas actually politics and life is more complex than that. If you're concerned about technology and what's coming, I think one of the big trends of the next few years is going to be people, we've mentioned this before, becoming interested again in religious ideas. Perversely, I think possibly from a sort of secular point of view, but if we are living in an age of machines and we're being bossed around by the algorithm, the question, what is it to be human, will become more and more relevant. Why do we do what we do? What is the motivation for looking after others? What is our interest in our fellow creature? And I just think he sort of shuts himself off with this really deterministic, quite brutal, tech-driven view of the world, which ultimately as well, the irony is vote leave was, I think most people who voted vote leave thought that it was a vote for democracy or self-government. I know Remain voters would contest that and say that that's a ludicrous notion. But that's why I think most people at their core did it. But actually, the vision of politics which Dom Cummings lays out is really bleak, and it doesn't leave. And I've been reading this stuff for weeks. It doesn't leave much scope for elected politicians. It seems to envisage a class of very sophisticated, tech-driven people of Dom's kind of personality telling us what to do. Now, I don't know what that is, but there are words for that kind of
it's a bit of a sort of
government.
Plato authoritarian, isn't he, in a way? You know?
Yeah, or maybe just
sort of Platonic.
Yeah.
The guardians rule us, and the rest are sort of subjugated.
For all of his belief in new technology and something, the thing that also strikes me about him is just he's basically quite pessimistic, and he's negative about most people and most institutions, and there's plenty to be negative about. But I think Ian, you and I offline a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember the exact context, but I always find one of the most interesting debates that conservatives have is whether they prefer Reagan or Thatcher. And, it's sort of the different sort of philosophical attitudes that each have, with Reagan being the morning in America person and Thatcher being the pull up your socks conservative. And, someone like Farage, who Cummings was a great opponent of, the reason why Farage is so successful is basically he has a positive disposition with the pint drinking and the cigarette smoking. Yes, he's critical of EU institutions, etc., but there's this warm person you want to be with, or enough people wanted to be with, that made him a success. I think Dom is becoming a sort of person you just don't want to hang around because he is so negative about everyone and everything. And I think there's a bigger lesson in that for the right.
Really, really interesting. And Dom, again, if you're watching, I mean, we're perfectly happy to hang out with you. And if you'd like to come on the show, you're very welcome.
Not sure Dom would be happy to hang out with me anymore, but you might be successful.
Well, we say it in a spirit of openness and generosity. But Maggie, your next choice, I think, is from Politico.
It is from Politico, from the European edition. And they were reporting on the debate, 5-hour debate within the EU interior ministers yesterday on what their policy, Tuesday actually, their policy would be towards the resettlement of Afghans. And as you probably know, basically, they decided not to put any numbers on it at all because they're terrified of what they call the pull effect. That was the German interior ministers. And he even cited Boris and, they've set 20,000 and sort of dismissed it. But there was quite a row between the Luxembourg, Germany, Slovenia, Austria, because they're just saying, no, we don't want to. One, they don't want to put numbers on it. Two, they're trying to stop them coming in to the individual countries. And so the offer is to give them £1 billion, between 600 million and £1 billion to bordering countries like Pakistan and Iran to keep the refugees in the camps and basically out of the EU. Now, this is obviously a huge shift in opinion, and I think it just shows the very sort of fragile state that EU countries, Germany and France have the borders up in the north. You've got Italy and Spain with the influx from North Africa and Africa generally, and then the deal that Germany did with Turkey, they're obviously trying to replicate. But it made me wonder whether, clearly there is a huge humanitarian crisis here. I don't know if you saw the photos of the Afghan refugees walking from Pakistan into Iran. Hundreds of miles, it's horrendous. And of course, it's not a numbers game, but I just sort of wondering, why aren't we using our international agencies more positively? The UN, where is the UN in this? Why aren't we using the peacekeeping forces? Couldn't NATO forces more volunteering? Because, in a sense, you can see why countries don't want to take 20, 30, 40,000, but also a lot of those Afghans, I'm sure, want to go back or find some way of resettling. Yeah. They don't want to uproot their families. So I just feel that there's a real moment where we need to get together, bang heads. And I haven't heard anything from the UN, but
do you think
there's a huge role there for them?
But is that is that possibly, do you think, Maggie, is that because it's too early? Because having the US having signed a deal with the Taliban and then withdrawn, what you're talking about would require, it's not engagement in a hot war, is it? It's not going back in to fight, but trying to put anything on the ground. I mean, everything, almost because of the deal the Americans have done, everything has to be negotiated with the Taliban. So we find ourselves in this extraordinary situation where the Taliban were the enemies of the West. And they certainly seem to be in the stories that are emerging from Kabul and the urban centers, the way in which they seem to be hunting people down. They seem to be the enemies of the Afghan people as well. But we sort of quite know what the dispensation is. And America and the UK and France now talking to the Taliban in an attempt to shut out or to combat ISIS. I mean, we've in the space of 3 or 4 weeks since we last did this show before the summer holiday, Maggie, everything's shifted.
No, absolutely. But we get troops on the ground quite quickly, don't we? We can do that in a couple of days. I'm just talking about putting up some big camps.
I see what you mean.
As much that's what I'm saying. Not even talking about. Of course, we have to talk to the Taliban and do deals. Now, I'm talking about the thousands and thousands of people. I mean, it's all very well for you to say, we'll give money, keep them out, put them on the borders, but shouldn't we be doing something? And in a sense, you want a neutral United Nations. It could be talking to Pakistan, talking to Iran. Iran is trying to do a deal with the US at the same time. It just seems a really critical moment where a lot of people, America, okay, retreat. I'm not sure it is retreat forever, actually. I think this is a, withdrawal. But we now need to see, I hate to use soft power, it's sort of an overused expression. We need to see real power and to help these people if we're going to do anything positive.
And there is this vacuum at the moment, isn't there? Because
Terrible.
Biden has made his position relatively clear in this instance, withdrawal and retreat of one sort or another. Merkel's leaving. Boris doesn't really have the international clout Macron can try. So the West is leaderless and uncoordinated. I just wanted to give you a chance, Maggie, to respond or to have a go at me about my idea on my pessimism about the West, because we recorded we recorded something this morning, also available to watch on our YouTube channel if you just hit subscribe, a short video on the end of Pax Americana, which is what I wrote my column on for the Times this week. And I just detected that you thought I was being unduly pessimistic. I see it as, I know history's not
fixed.
Well, it doesn't directly repeat, does it? No,
it doesn't.
It
and
rhymes rather than
ride
repeat.
We've had since the 1920s with American.
But my point was just about the direction of travel of US policy over the course of the last 3 presidencies is to try and disengage and withdraw from other people's wars, while still, of course, maintaining bases around the world. But I just think it's an attitude of mind that's changed because American voters have changed. But you think I'm being too pessimistic?
I think you are, because I think the withdrawal, I mean, we haven't yet talked about whether we think withdrawal is right or wrong. Personally, I think withdrawal was absolutely the right thing to do, but carried out in the most cat-candid way you can think possible. But you said something at the beginning of this morning's conversation was really interesting. You said, so on the one hand, the American culture has never been stronger, whether it is Facebook, social culture, tech, innovation, Elon Musk up in space and all the rest of it. And yet America's retreating. Now, I think that's really, the paradox is that most people in the world, huge generalization, want to live that sort of American dream. So if you took away, perhaps not the Taliban militants, but most people in Afghanistan, they want to have their iPhone, they want their Nike shoes, they do want to have decent relations with family. So I think actually the West has great power, and it's just that we've misused it by militarily intervening. I think we should be much more confident about our values, and whether you call them liberal values or whatever. But it's not, you cannot impose those values. You can't tell the Afghans to send X to school. you have to show. And I think we can do that in a much stronger way.
But then,
That sounds very idealistic. It's very idealistic.
A Times reader pointed out to me that you've seen that contradiction play out before, which is, America retreats in terms of foreign policy in the 1920s, becomes isolationist after the 1919 rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, doesn't join the League of Nations, which dooms the fledgling international system. However, America throughout the 1920s simultaneously dramatically increases its cultural power because of the spread of the film industry and the role of Wall Street throughout the 1920s before the crash, becoming ever more powerful as the world's global financial capital, a process which begins during the First World War. So and it doesn't end very well. That was my point, is that if people didn't like an overactive and interventionist America, didn't like the consequences for the world, I'm just worried that they're not going to like the consequences of America not being engaged. But we'll see. Tim,
good opportunity for us in Europe, though, and
yes.
we do need to build bridges with our neighbours across the Channel. Actually, I think it's a great opportunity.
Tim.
So yeah, a regular podcast that I listen to, we're going back to America now, I'm afraid, is called the 3 Martini Lunch. You do not have to drink 3 martinis while listening to it, although it's certainly possible that you might like to. Maggie will remember the days in the city when 3 martini or equivalent lunches were very common. But
that was before lunch. That was a sharpener they used to call that.
Exactly.
I love that phrase, a sharpener.
Yeah.
We could make this press review an awful lot more interesting if we had our martini. But
next time,
maybe near Christmas or something. But it's just a very simple idea. It lasts about 20-25 minutes. Jim Geraghty of National Review is the main interviewee, but what they do is they take the news largely from a sort of conservative perspective, and they award good, bad, or whatever martinis, just to say this is, what's happening in the world of unemployment or judicial nominations or Supreme Court decisions, whatever it is. Just a light, fun, fast introduction to what's happening in that day's US politics from a conservative perspective. And it fits a little bit about what I was saying just a few minutes ago. It's a positive upbeat. You like the people who are talking, and not that isn't always true of the sort of more angrier Fox News presentation, for example. And so, for those like me who are obsessed with American politics, I recommend it, and it's a sort of an antidote or balance to how America is generally reported.
Just going to ask there, Tim, what you made of Maggie and the discussion that Maggie and I were having there about the role of America and where stands America. Am I being too pessimistic about the story of life since Iraq and Obama and the Obama-Trump America first, and then Biden, as far as I can see, sort of completes the process, or the switch back to isolationism? Do you think that can be changed by a future president? I can't see anyone on the horizon, though American politics sometimes produces someone over the course of a decade that you didn't necessarily anticipate or expect who changes the direction. But I can't see anyone at the moment. Do you think that there's an opportunity for being hopeful about it?
You've always got to be hopeful, but for example, what Maggie just said about people around the world still wanting to live in America, that cultural power that America has, I think that is true, but I think it's a lot less true than it was. I loved America, sort of the image of the silver screen generation from Hollywood when Reagan was president. And I find America now a much more divided, angry society. And I used to visit America most years, and I haven't visited for a long time now, certainly not since. I don't feel the attraction to America that I did. It's not the shining city on a hill that it was to me. So culturally, the negativity, the anger of Hollywood It often doesn't seem proud of America anymore. I don't like what America projects about itself. And then I think the sort of, if you look at the last set of presidents, Clinton famously took his holiday from history, whereby he really did only focus on the USA, and you had the build-up in, for example, Afghanistan to what then happened on 9/11. You had the Bush presidency with the wars going wrong. You had Obama presidency, whereby nothing was done anything about like North Korea, and where red line in Syria were crossed and nothing was done about them. Then we had Trump, don't need to say more. Now we have Biden retreating. It's not as though America's taken a few missteps under one president. We've now got nearly 3 decades
of 30 years
presidents that have failed in different ways. And I think you begin to have to think, well, this isn't a function or a problem of one president or another. There's something wrong in the world superpower at a more fundamental level.
Now, I agree. I completely agree with you. And for any of our American friends watching, this is not directed at you, and I cannot wait to get to New York and Washington and elsewhere and see people. And I miss individual people in America, and some American galleries, and some aspects of American life. So this criticism is meant to, in a filial, friendly fashion. But just when you were talking there, Tim, about it's almost 30 years since Clinton. If you look at a documentary, which I always go on about, The War Room, which is the story of Clinton winning that 92 presidency, so much of that, it doesn't look that different from now. America, because it hasn't had the investment in infrastructure, the way its airports are crumbling, its rail system, the way it sort of looks and feels, it feels almost frozen in time, the sort of styling in its hotel rooms, all of that. So that's the first criticism I would make, that something has gone wrong with the public realm. And America used to look in the 50s and 60s and 70s like a version of the future, and it now looks kind of dated, although America still has extraordinary economic power because of the dollar. The other thing I think that may have gone wrong, and that Americans should think about, is the internet. And the way in which 20 years ago, we didn't see that much of America. Yes, you saw it on the evening news. It was very difficult to get hold of American papers. They had newspapers or magazines. They had an exotic quality to them. America was distant. And maybe that absence makes the heart grow fonder and all of that. Now we're living in, if you're on social media at all, and thanks to the Trump experience, we had to wake up every morning waiting to see what on earth he'd said on Twitter. We live in an American created world, which is on social media is incredibly divisive and divided and unpleasant. So it's not something to aspire to. And that's what, without getting into the whole BLM thing of last year, that's one of the things that distressed me about the whole thing. Regardless of the rights and wrongs, it was an importation of American political culture, which would have, I think, been regarded as probably as unorthodox or weird 30 years ago. Now, because of the internet, flows within hours or minutes in a viral form into the UK. So I'm slightly with Tim there, Maggie, that brand America is not maybe in the healthy condition that you suggested.
I wasn't suggesting that it was healthy. And I didn't mean people want to live in America, but the sense of the freedom that America still portrays. That's what I was trying to get across. If you're living, in Iran, political prisoner there, or dentist or whatever, you are still looking to the West. They won't know about the crumbling hotel rooms or the BLM, in a sense. I'm talking about what it represents, which is why I think what America's done over the last 40, 50 years you just described is go and military intervene in all these countries and mess them up. I'm saying there's a cleverer way than going in and intervening, because it's still a good way of living. Most people are still freer in America.
Yeah, and there's still
in the Middle East.
Further to that point, Maggie, there's still
that's what I
tens of millions of people want to live in America.
Yeah.
And immigration wouldn't be such a live issue in America if that wasn't the case. So people maybe see the problems, factor that in, and still see it as a land of opportunity. And I stress again to American viewers and American friends that I can't wait to.
You're very worried about losing your dinner invitations, aren't you, Ian? From American friends?
I just love it. I know everyone says New York is not America, and of course it's not. And it's an idealized European version of idea of America, but I have to admit I still love it and can't wait to go to this is so European and middle class, but I can't wait to go to the Frick collection in New York and then go for a martini afterwards, which I think sort of brings us naturally to an end. Not 3 martinis, just 1, because on the old bartender's rule is 1 martini is never enough, but 2 is too many.
The Reaction Editors there with their weekly pick of global stories and great journalism. I'm Francesca Peacock. This is the Reaction Podcast. Until next week, thank you for listening.